With about a week left of my semester abroad, I decided it was about time I experienced St. Andrews on a more intimate level. Alone. Just me and the place. It started as a practical sort of walk, strolling casually along the sidewalk, in no real rush, but with specific destinations in mind. Then it became more of an aimless meander around town, letting my whims and the momentum of my body guide me. The epitome of the Scottish walkabout. Of course, I had always planned to make time to walk along the pier and visit the cathedral ruins and take pictures of all the beautiful sights. But classes, modules here, and my social calendar, mostly going to balls and bops with mates to get lashed, or just having a wee dram or a couple of pints at a local pub, and the general business of being abroad had gotten in the way up until this point. After stopping at a minuscule coffee shop near the end of North Street to chug a latte, my feet brought me past the ruins where the three main streets in St. Andrews converge to the rocky shore of the North Sea. I gazed, in slightly hungover, caffeine-buzzed awe, at the snow-blanketed concrete pier and the tormented sea beyond. The pier stretched out to sea at an imperfect right angle to the land and harbor, where dilapidated fishing boats with faded chipping paint that once gleamed in primary colors bobbed, while seagulls alighted on them and pecked at their lines in splintered wood. The end of the thin pier loomed far in the distance, its craggy concrete surface slick with wintry precipitation. It had a slight curve to it, and the further it extended, the greater became the distance between its top edge and the rocks and salt water below. This must have had something to do with how it began on slightly elevated land and stretched out to sea level, since there was no incline to the pier. I chalked it up to some mathematical explanation I didn't care to take the time to comprehend. It looked ancient and refined, blending in with the natural surroundings in the way only very old human constructions can. It was as if it had always been there, part of the rock formations that developed organically beneath the surface of the sea and protruded above it. All I could do for a moment was gaze at the wonder before me. Then I felt I needed to capture it. In the face of beauty, I often feel an irrepressible need to do something to save it, to keep it for myself. So I spent a sizable chunk of time taking photographs from different angles with different points of focus, trying to get a bit of everything in sight so my photo album would represent all the important parts. But after a while, I gave my camera a rest, partly because it had just informed me that its battery was exhausted. If it was a Scottish camera, it would have been knackered, and partly because I wanted to make sure I took some mental pictures as well. I decided to take a solitary pier walk, a tradition usually reserved for students in their bright red academic gowns post-Sunday morning church services. Thinking it must be a relatively calm experience, since many people do it regularly, I mounted the higher side of the pier and began walking. It was not a calm experience. I failed to recognize that organized pier walks usually do not take place in the winter, considering the unfavorable weather conditions. As the distance behind me to the shore increased, so did the distance down to the menacing rocks below, salt water violently slapping against them. A thin layer of slick, wet snow lay atop the frozen stone of the ledge along which I was now proceeding. The path seemed to be growing thinner as I walked, and my steps felt wobbly and unsure on the slippery surface. There was nothing separating me from the edge of the concrete, where it dropped off straight down to the sea. No railing or fence, or even an occasional post. The only safety net in sight was a metal railing that sprouted up just 5 feet or so from the end, as if to prevent someone who made it that far from continuing right off the edge. I slowed my pace, feeling a bit weak, and briefly entertained the idea of going the rest of the way on all fours. But no, I thought, I'm already halfway there, and I was actually enjoying the thrill of the treacherous walk to some extent, so I decided to follow it through to the end. I hoped that end would not be the misplacement of a boot-clad foot and a harrowing fall to my death, where no one would find my body for hours or even days. But I tried not to let the thought consume me. I also tried to take my mind off the recent death of a student who fell from one of the cliffs just a short distance down the shore. I had seen the flowers draped over the fence days before, in memoriam. His name was Alex Wilson. He was 19 years old, a fresher. It was Friday, November 6th, 2009, 1:35 a.m. He thought it was a shortcut to the beach, where he was expected at a bonfire. So he jumped the fence, dropping 60 feet to the North Sea, and his death. There were signs. This had happened several times in the past, prompting increased signage and fencing. But it's very unlikely that he was sober. Of course he didn't take the time to read the warnings on the low fence. This oversight cost him his life. Shivering in an attempt to shake off disturbing thoughts, I marched on, heart thumping wildly under layers of sweaters, jumpers, and my winter jacket. Philosophy major that I am, I was somewhat morbidly amused by the idea of reaching my life's end by slipping off the St. Andrew's Pier while walking alone on a frigid morning. It would hurt, sure, but then it would be over, and I would probably be nothing, feel nothing, think nothing, and it would be a pretty awesome, bloody brilliant, if you will, way to die. My family and friends would be devastated, of course, and probably a little angry at my recklessness, but they would console themselves with the knowledge that I died mid-adventure, full of independence, taking a risk, experiencing a turning point in my life to its fullest. Or maybe they would know none of this. Maybe they would assume I was just out for a walk and slipped, and that was it. That it was a freak accident, and I never felt any sort of adrenaline rush or defining moment of my young life while walking along that pier. Or worse, that I had even done it on purpose, for some unknown reason, or impulsively. No, they could never think that. But how would they have any way of knowing what really happened? Then again, there were so many ways I could have died every day. Why did this moment seem to bring me so much closer to death? There was a slightly elevated level of risk involved, but the same could be said about flying in an airplane, staying in a hostel, especially that one in Vienna, texting while driving, binge drinking. But I didn't meet my demise in any of those cases. I started to ponder whether it mattered at all how or when I died. It really wouldn't have any effect on me, since there would be no me anymore. Right? As these half-formed thoughts jumbled around in my brain, I kept the metal railing at the end of the pier in my line of vision at all times. Though I had considered it somewhat futile, I was grateful now that it would provide some stability when the worst was over. Almost there. No matter how adept I appeared to be at suspending judgment and emotion in the midst of philosophical inquiry, I still feared death and did not want to come close to it today. At last, I reached my hand out for the railing, took the last few nervous steps, and leaned into it with relief. Breathing unevenly from the combination of cold and nerves, I took a moment to calm down. A distinctly fishy, yet not overpowering, odor wafted through the air, carried by the steady wind. The tips of my fingers had started to feel numb, poking through my gray, woolly, hobo-style gloves. I turned my body toward land, leaning my back against the rail to take in the view. It was like a picture from a book of fairy tales. St. Rule's Tower and the rest of the cathedral ruins loomed, distinguished, in the distance, a winding path leading down from them toward the harbor. To the right, stretching boldly out toward the sea, lay the ruins of St. Andrew's Castle, which I had managed to visit on one of my first days in town. I could almost picture the once mighty structures, now crumbling and sinking into the earth, in all their glory. Once I had had my fill of this panorama, I spun around to peer down over the railing to the ocean's surface below. From about 40 feet, or 12 meters as a non-American would judge it, above the water at low tide, the drop was dizzying. But I had made it to the end and could take the much safer route back to shore by way of the lower, wider side of the pier. I stood there, taking in all possible views, for several minutes. The day was clear and the sun shone down, but there was a fuzzy quality about the air and a crispness in the wind, a bite to the cold. It was a different sort of winter than I was used to. Winter in my native New Hampshire town comes in bursts and flurries, enveloping you in a serene, quiet, whitewashed world. My past 2 winters in central New York had proven to be all-encompassing. The season begins in October and consumes the landscape in blizzards and chills until April or May. Scotland was different. There was more wind and less precipitation, and it just seemed more unpredictable to me. It probably didn't help that everyone had told me, "It never snows here," when I first arrived, and then insisted, once they were proven wrong, that this winter was a special exception to the rule. As I grew increasingly cold and my layers seemed to decrease in bulk, I remained rooted to my spot at the end of the pier. There was not another human being in sight. Apparently, no one else was crazy enough to venture so near the ocean on a frigid day like this. I savored the alone time, the serenity of spending time with just myself and my environment. I was trying to capture this moment in memory, so I could take it with me when I left in just a few short days. It struck me how quickly the past few months had gone by. I had often heard older students gush about their study abroad experiences and how quickly they were over. I had also listened to the adults in my life mourn the quickening pace of the years as they grew older. But never before had those sentiments resonated within me so powerfully. Maybe it's because we start having more poignant moments and forming deeper connections to people and places as we get older. Maybe trying to hold on to moments makes them slip past that much quicker. I sighed and pulled the top parts of my gloves down over my exposed fingertips, converting them into mittens, before making my way down the ladder to the lower platform. Later, as I trudged reluctantly back toward my dorm, hall, resigned to dedicating the rest of the day to studying for finals, revision, the ever-present knowledge that I may never be back here again floated to the surface of my thoughts. It filled me with conflicting emotions that I couldn't fully reconcile at the time. It was sad and a little scary, but at the same time it gave me a wonderful, refreshing feeling. It made me feel full of life. Aside from the accomplishments of adapting to a new culture and planning and executing trips to foreign countries on my own, I had a sense of something more that I had learned here. Something like this. The pace of time quickens with age, which is upsetting in many ways, but that's what makes all the individual moments, as well as the whole, of a human life so beautiful. We can't save anything. Pictures and souvenirs, and even memories, are not the real thing. We can only experience each moment once, and most of them will not register as important to us. This is both the tragedy and the bliss of the human condition. Life and all of its moments are fleeting, and we will never be able to hold on to anything. What greater motivation to experience it to its fullest could there be? Even the philosopher in me grew tired of all this high-minded theorizing by the time I reached John Burnet Hall. So I settled down at my desk and, ironically, began one of my final philosophy papers in St. Andrews. Feeling reassured at my choice of major by the fact that I could handle even more philosophizing in one day, I put thoughts of the passing of time and the human condition out of my mind and transitioned to metaphysics and science. But I didn't spend the rest of the day on it as planned. As David Hume, the Scottish philosopher we studied thoroughly in that very class, once said, "Be a philosopher, but, amidst all your philosophy, be still a human."